So now I'm going to introduce committee member Micah Hayes, whose idea it was to have this meeting to introduce Jim. So Micah?
Hello, yes. Hello, everybody. Nice to have you here. Jim, thank you for coming. Jim Rondinelli, we're going to talk about his work today on a number of albums, but in particular, engineering and producing or producing um, work with Matthew Sweet. We're going to talk about Matthew Sweet's girlfriend in 91. I guess we can go chronologically. And Wilco being there in 1996, and Weezer's Pinkerton in 96, and then Everclear's So Much for the Afterglow in 97. And so yes, it was a yeah, so anyway, before we start though, I just want to say thank you for making these albums that are so amazing sounding. Like they're some of my favorite sounding albums of all times, but also just like some of my favorite musically. And I've listened to them, especially some of them more than hundreds of times. So, thank you for that. I really do appreciate that. They're really wonderful music. And we're going to listen to some of it also as we talk, just so everybody knows. I have a Spotify playlist here that I will share. Um, but yeah, so Jim, I guess we could start to speak about the Girlfriend album, which I remember you saying that it was the album probably that got you the most work. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I literally still get calls to this day from that record, which never ceases to amaze me. So, just brief background. Thanks for having me here, Micah, and I apologize to everybody else for tonight's panel. But I started in this business as a young. Well, my interest in audio came really young. My brother was in bands. I was born in the early '60s. It was the tail end of the Beatles era when I became aware of music. And as soon as I found out that there was this guy, George Martin, who got to actually be in the studio with all this really interesting gear and direct and oversee performances, I knew that that was what I had to do. And I think literally every step in my life from that point forward until I did it was sort of singularly focused on how in the heck do I get to pull this off, especially as a kid growing up, born in New York, but unfortunately, dad moved the family to Iowa so he could take a job running a meat packing company. Funny enough, that ended up being a lucky break because the University of Iowa, where I attended, had a Studer A80 and a Neve 5315 and nobody using it, and a tremendous collection of microphones thanks to the generosity of Stephen Temmer and Gotham Audio, uh, who was a huge fan of one of my early mentors, Lowell Cross, the electronic music composer. So Stephen came in frequently, at least once a year, and did training and sessions on mics. We had an EMT 250 mono, and we just had ridiculous equipment in that studio, and not a lot of people around to use it. And most importantly, it was supposed to be only used for student recitals and classical recordings, which means that of course I would sneak bands in at night, buy 2-inch reels, privately, and record bands from midnight until 4 or 5 in the morning to do some of my early recordings. That was kind of fortunate. Chapter 2 came after I still couldn't figure out how to find work as a producer. So I got a job selling recording studio equipment and then ultimately marketing studio equipment. First at a retailer, briefly at a retailer in San Francisco called Sound Genesis. After that, at a console manufacturer, Neotech, which is no longer with us, but there's still plenty of consoles around, and worked in the factory right next to the production floor. And then after that, I got recruited to go to work at Brüel & Kjær Microphones. Brüel & Kjær was the equivalent of a graduate degree in microphone technology. Ole Brusted Sorensen, who is the father of those microphones, fortunately is still with us, and the principal design mind behind DPA Pro Audio, is a first grade educator. And Brüel & Kjær was interestingly enough, for those of you who know Immersion Networks, very similar in that it was a pure research lab at the corporate campus. And yeah, there were accounting functions, there were finance functions, and there were sales functions, but 80% of the floor space in the corporate offices were separate from manufacturing, but in the offices, 80% was science and researchers. And their business model was fascinating. Their business model was, we hear of this scientist at this university who's starting to publish papers on sound and vibration and take a different approach to it. So they would rush in, custom design equipment for this person, and do it for free, with the caveat that when the ANSI and IEC spec came out for that measurement, it would say the reference standard is the Brewing Care model 2252 or whatever, which worked really well until software came in. But the fortunate part about Brewing Care for me was that it gave me visibility, access to an anechoic chamber, some tremendous scientific minds, materials engineers, but most importantly, a chance to work with a ton of different microphones and techniques that I hadn't worked with before. So back in the Neotech days, I started financing recordings for bands, and that fortunately meshed into when late 80s, indie rock turned grunge turned alternative started to become popular. And I was financing a lot of these recordings. And my bands and recordings were getting signed first by indies, and then the indies would get picked up by majors. The second album I got called to do by second, is that right? Yeah, third album I got called by A&M to do was Matthew Sweet's Girlfriend, which we made for A&M. They dropped, and it became a platinum record elsewhere. Couple of funny things about Girlfriend, and it might be a good opportunity to listen to it. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, there's only one spot on the record where two musicians are playing at the same time. Everybody talks about how great and how live it sounds, but it's literally entirely overdubs because we built a process with rules that I'll talk about in a little bit, that was modeled mostly on how Matthew recorded his very elaborate demos at home. So with that, maybe it's time to kick off a song from that.
Yeah. So which song would you like me to play?
We should probably, the very first one, Divine Intervention, is probably a great one.
Yeah, I do actually really love that tune too. Do you want to talk? Okay, we'll listen to it. Yeah, but I also want to talk a little bit more, eventually about like how stripped down the production and whatnot was. But you're right. I should take a listen here. Screen share my Spotify. There it is. Okay, stereo, good. Share. Okay. All right. So let's see if we can hear that. Can you hear that and see it?
In stereo.
That's promised. It'll fade there at a couple minutes in. Yeah, what a great tune.
That was the great Richard Lloyd from television on guitar, by the way. There were moments when Richard would play where his stuff would just be so ridiculous. I remember vividly just popping out of my chair with excitement. But there were some interesting things about this record in terms of approach. So again, no simultaneous performances. Everything is one overdub with another. Typically we do drums with a scratch rhythm guitar and then immediately replace the rhythm guitar before putting on bass. That's also something different. Anything anybody else notice about that recording that they want to comment on or ask about? I can go into some other stuff, but I'm just curious as you hear it, what are some of the
very wide?
Yes. It is really a dual mono, less than stereo recording. And a lot of that has to do with the records that, in fact, this whole thing is a study in the records that were just coming out on CD. So almost every day of this record, somebody would stop by, or all of us would stop by different record stores and pick up whatever record had just come out on CD that we had been waiting for. That could be Neil Young Harvest, it could be Yes Fragile, it could be Esquivel, it could be anything. But somehow we'd all listen and dig into those records, and it would have this immediate effect. It would permeate whatever we were doing in the studio that day. Anything else? Any other quick observations?
There's just the lack of reverb, right? I mean,
Yeah, it sounds very dry.
yeah.
There is, that's correct, Michael. There is literally no reverb on the record. Any ambience. In fact, there are no the recalls, because we're still doing pen and paper recalls. Literally, the aux buses are not used on the console. However, everything was recorded in 150, 160 square foot room, made of plywood, with plywood floors, furring strips as diffusers on the wall, that had been built with a floated floor inside what used to be the penthouse of the Studio 54 building at Axis Studios, New York. Funny enough, also a couple of other interesting things. There were two other records happening simultaneous with us, so we'd work 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off. The first record was CNC's Music Factory, Gonna Make You Sweat.
Very different
All
sounding.
that stuff. And the other one was Madonna Vogue.
Also
It was a really charmed time, and there were a lot of people kind of floating in and out of each other's sessions, which was.
And so, so you said it was the former Studio 54 in New York. Is that where
the Disco Studio 54? It's on the 16th floor penthouse. It was on the 16th floor penthouse, and unfortunately, like all great New York recording studios, it is no longer a recording studio.
Did Dana Burke have a question? You got your mic unmuted.
Hi, Dana.
Dana?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Okay.
Dana's got some really interesting stuff he's working on too, which we're going to have to, that might be almost worthy of another meeting, but we can talk about that a little later. Oh, yes.
Great.
Dana's got some really interesting. Dana is a previous colleague from Brewin Care.
All right.
Proud to say.
So sorry, Jim. So one of the things that also stands out to me from the sound, is it's interesting because, when this came out, how conscious were you, I guess, of sort of, by like taking out like the reverb, like we were saying, for example, because, like most of the music in the mid to late 80s was like highly reverberant, like the Careless Whisper, whatever type of long reverb tail, a lot of that stuff, and how much of it was a conscious pushback against that? Was that something, or was that, or was it not like even conscious? Was it something you just sort of did naturally as a band?
Oh, it was very conscious. So we started this record with a bunch of rules, and it's funny because Matthew had a record on A&M before this called Earth that largely uses the same personnel except me, and we used Richard Lloyd in place of Gary Lucas and Bob Quine, who was on both records, but it's basically the same people. That record had keyboard pads on, really lush synth pads on it, still really amazing songs, but it was covered in the flurry of reverb that was popular in those days. And then there's Matthew's voice, and Matthew is a great soulful singer, and his voice suits his songs really well. But Matthew is also not the guy who would have gone on, if there was an America's Got Talent or American Idol or The Voice in those days as a singer. So I wanted to frame Matthew's voice, take a fundamentally different approach because I thought the songs were great, but I wanted to frame Matthew's voice with things that were equally rough, which meant bone dry everything except for the ambience captured in the room. And there's a story about miking technique as well, which we'll talk about a little bit. Bone dry drums, nothing on his voice whatsoever. lots of compression to make it, tube compression, in his case, mostly LA2, to get it to distort and add some edge to his voice. But really, again, to set up a framework that was complementary to his voice instead of creating a contrast to it. The other rules we had on this record, and I'm a huge believer in production, and to be full disclosure, this album was, I'm responsible for the sound of everything on the record, but the album was really produced by Matthew himself and Fred Marr, Matthew's longtime collaborator and a dear friend, both dear friends. So they should get the credit for the production and all of that. But other rules we had in starting the record: no precision bass. Why? Because when we plugged in the Hofner, the thicker sound of the Hofner, which we know not only from Beatles records, but from all those great Sly and Robbie and reggae records, just filled in a different spectrum than the P bass. So we made it a rule. Another rule we had is there are no stomp boxes. Every guitar that you hear on that record, including the solos, is Andy Marshall from Woodinville, or now from Snohomish, Washington's THD Bassman 410 clone that he made, that we all immediately fell in love with as soon as we heard it, turned up to 11, with the poor guitar player sitting on a short lead in front of the amp. That was another rule. And then finally, I was able to get a lot of layering, and this goes back to Ola Brosted. Was able to get a lot of layering between sounds by using a lot of microphones in the recording that are out of phase. So when I'm recording a guitar amplifier in this era, I have something in front of it like a 57 or a 409 or a Brüling Care 4007. And in back of it, I usually have an 87 out of phase, equidistant. And then I'm dialing the balance between the two of them just to get a different sound and texture out of each of the tracks, even if something was doubled. The tracks would be slightly different, have slightly different out of phase elements. Similarly with the drums in this point, it was ridiculous because here's a 165-foot, studio, and I've got all the mics drummed as we, or drums mic'd as we would in those days, top and bottom, with KM84s as overheads, 421s on the top, but 87s on the bottom, again out of phase. So there was leakage everywhere. And I later realized that there was a lot easier way to get that leakage, and we'll get to that on some of the other recordings, but the leakage is where we get the sound of, whatever ambience is on there, and then the compression to change the ratio of the bleed and the leakage.
You talk about the leakage between which instruments specifically?
Well, actually, since no two instruments are simultaneous, I mean, so there's like tons of hi-hat and all of the tom mics. So there's the tom mics, the tom tracks don't sound like toms. Now, there's one exception on this. Girlfriend, the single in the title track of this album, was done only with 12 tracks and only with 3 microphones on the drums.
Oh, wow. 3. Where were they, the mics?
In the classic Glyn Johns position of, roughly 6 feet apart in front of the bass drum, an overhead, and off to the right of the floor tom and a little bit behind.
That's interesting. Sorry, Rick has his hand raised there. I just noticed. Rick, do you have a question? Rick, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. If you're unmuted, you're muted. Okay.
Must have been an accident.
Yes. So do you want to listen
An
to a little bit?
accidental hand raise from the senator from Sammamish.
That's right.
No accident.
Okay,
Phone
hey.
rang.
Oh, okay.
Jim, out of phase mics that you used on the guitar amps, did you pan them to the same point, or did you spread them a
Yes.
little?
No, I actually combine them all to one track. So another thing that I'm a huge believer sorry, is make your decisions on the fly. So there is a wonderful human being and a great producer called Pierre Marchand who did all the Sarah McLachlan records. And we collaborated on a record once. And he's a great guy and a wonderful musician who makes beautiful records. And it drove me crazy because Pierre's thought is record everything and make your decisions at the end. And my view is different. Making an album is a series of forks in the road. And every decision that you make should be informed by the decisions you made prior. So if something doesn't feel right, you can just go one step back, undo, and go in the other direction. But as long as things are feeling good, you still go down that path. So for me, what does that mean? More specifically, that means comping on the fly and erasing the source material for the comps afterwards. Even in the workstation era, I don't want to go back to it. I want to know that that's closed in my mind. It meant on analog, using a lot of EQ and compression before tape as well as after. Why? Well, part of it was to overcome the limitations of analog tape, which I loved, but you had to work it differently. And part of it, again, was this idea of making decisions. If I could get it to come off of tape and sound right, then I wouldn't really need to do that much when I mixed it.
That's so interesting. And so you were talking about with the guitar cabinet as well. It sounded really interesting. So where did you learn that technique? You said you had a normal 57 in the front, but then a U87 out of phase in the back.
A U87 out of phase, or a 57, a 409. It could be a 441. Depends on what the amplifier needed or what the track needed. Even sometimes the same amp in the same setting and the same player, a different track just might require something a little bit different. So that was really a result of a lot of experimentation. So Fred Marr was adamant about recording the drums out of phase with the 87 under the toms. So I'm thinking, okay, if we're going to do that there, let's try it on the guitar amps too.
Interesting. Do you want to, so let's take a listen actually to that Girlfriend song, and then remind us while I'm queuing this up, kind of, you mentioned how it was 3 microphones on the drums
in the classic Glyn Johns position. So it's first of all, the drums are tuned wide and open and bright. It's a Gretsch kit from the 80s, a stop sign kit, white heads, top and bottom. And it is a 67 on the top, a D12 on the bass drum, and a Brewing Care 4007 in the floor tom position, or 4006 in the floor tom position.
Is that Omni, or what pattern?
Yes, Omni.
Omni, yeah.
And Omnis are going to come into play as we continue and work down the playlist a little bit, because I think Omnis, I believe strongly, and it's my DPA Brewing Care employee talking, but I believe that Omnis are a tremendous underutilized asset for recording. So
yeah, I remember those. We had those up at the Banff Center. We had the 006s, those BMKs, and those Omnis that we would use. But that was more classical types of music, so use a lot. Typically would use a lot more Omnis. But using it though, like you're describing it, and more pop rock music is less or is more unusual. So
yeah, people, I can tell you from trying to sell the things to studios, people were like, it's an Omni. Well, I can't do anything with it. I don't know how to use it. And the reality is they didn't. So this is another thing, right? I view a drum set, and this was kind of the beginning of the evolution as you go later and later in my recordings, with the exception of the Everclear record, which is a tweezer job, meaning it's Pro Tools to death. I view the drum set as one instrument. And as a drummer in remission, I try to find a point to stand and get it, and hopefully you have a player who has an intrinsic balance on the instrument and treat it that way, as it's one sound source instead of a bunch of little sound sources. If it's one sound source and you get the balance right, then everything becomes easier. Everything naturally falls into place.
Cool. All right, let's hear this here. So this is the girl, Matthew's sweet girlfriend here. Fade there.
Yeah, nice fade. The great, may he rest in peace, Bob Quine, frequent collaborator with Lou Reed on lead guitar, who I miss tremendously. Anyway, yeah, 3 mics, only 12 tracks total in the recording.
12, huh? That's crazy. Did you have a 24-track recording device, but you only used 12 of them?
Yes.
Impressive.
Yeah. No automation. And oh, by the way, that's the other thing on this guy, no automation. These are all live manual mixes, which was, fell into the rule set. And also it happened that that particular console, which was an AMEC Angela, that was the same, was used right before me on Depeche Mode Violator, which is exactly the same console in the same room. Only had Audio Kinetics automation on it, and you'd had to use a tape track to record, not only time code but then automation data as well. And it's just like, why bother?
So there were no, you said there was no automation, but were you moving the faders at all when you mixed to tape or when you bounced to
Oh God,
tape?
yes. Well,
Yeah.
when we mixed a 2-track, yes.
Right.
Or as the kids would say, bounced to the 2-track today.
That's what I just called it, but yes.
Yes, yes.
On half-inch tape.
It's the stem versus tracks discussion waiting to happen again. But yeah, it was recorded. So funny thing, also, you just brought up, reminding me of something. This record was recorded to half-inch 2-track, and we listened back to it, and we felt that we all came to this, as did Bob Ludwig, came to the same conclusion that it felt better off of the DAT than it did off of the half-inch 2-track. I don't know why, and it's just the standard A to D, so I hear all of my colleagues cringing. But for some reason, the half-inch analog just added too much thickness to this particular recording. And this was also in the days of 456. It was before the better analog tapes like, BASF 900, which I really loved and used exclusively at the end.
Interesting. Yeah, because obviously you'd think the tape would sound better typically, right? But the DATs.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and literally, Bernie Grunman did the vinyl mastering for it for a reissue. He came to the same conclusion. So who knew?
I actually remember Bernie Grunman, or somebody from his mastering studio. I remember coming into my class when I was at Chico State studying audio and sort of giving some demos. He brought his mastering equipment and give an introduction to mastering. But yeah, pretty impressive. They make their own, a lot of most of their own analog gear and really, really carefully, right? And
oh yeah. Yeah, those guys knew what they were doing.
For sure. So
That
speaking
track-
of, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, this is a good time.
That track that you just played was the title track. Would this be a good time to talk about the album cover?
Thanks for mentioning that, Dan. So if you look at the album cover,
Bring it up, Micah.
The album cover model, which Michael pull up.
There we go.
It's a 16-year-old actress, Tuesday Weld, who would later become a huge Hollywood megastar. But this is her promo shot when she was 16. She's sitting in Mulholland Canyon for this picture. So we want to license. We knew that this photo was out there. We all knew that this was the album cover. We had to have this as the shot. but the original title of the album was from the last song on the album, Nothing Lasts. So the original title at the top would have been Matthew Sweet, Nothing Lasts, which we thought would be great irony until we went to get the photo release from Tuesday. And she's like, look, you don't usually do these things, but I like this photo a lot. It represents a really good time for me. And, I'm more than willing to listen to, to license it, but I will not sign a photo release if you call this Nothing Lasts.
With her, because it was her picture.
Because with her face underneath it.
She's old. Yeah, she's old.
And so that's when the album became Girlfriend, and she fell in love with it.
And she was not 16 at the time, was she?
Well, she was 16 at the time of that photo, but she was
Yes.
what, in her 60s at that point?
Yeah.
Yes, I would imagine. I wouldn't like that either. Yeah.
So might be a little bit sensitive about it. But anyway, that's a brief craziness on Matthew Sweet. So I continued to get a lot of work. So another lesson about the music business and how to stay sane. We finished this record in September of 1990, and I thought, this is the greatest record I've ever done. And shortly thereafter, we found out that the A&R person, Steve Urbalski, who signed it at A&M, was leaving for Elektra, and that meant only one thing: death. Because it was death for the album, because the album would be dropped with extreme prejudice by the label he had just left, because nobody wanted to give success to the guy who just abandoned ship. So fortunately, back to great record company executives, the great Al Cafaro and the late Milt Olin, who was a total piece of work and a sweetheart, their general counsel, said, look, we are loaded up with all this college rock stuff. This record doesn't sound like any of it. It doesn't really fit within our brand. Why don't you just go find a home for it? We won't ask for an override. We'll release you from the contract. Just go find a new home for it. So basically, they let us take the record. And then we're trying to get other labels to pick it up. That took about a year. And we heard that this BMG label, Zoo, was just starting up by one of the guys who had signed Metallica, and they'd already signed two other bands, Tool and Green Jelly, and people were thinking that this was going to be a really great place. And the Lou Malia, another great industry legend, approved the signing of the record, but then one day dropped it. So all of a sudden, we're all excited because the record's going to come out, and then nothing happens. We hear that the record's not going to be coming out on Zoo. The head of A&R, Bud Scappa, who I wanted to make probably a dozen records for after that, had a plan. He knew that Bud would come in, Lou, his boss, would come into the office every morning at about 8 in the morning to walk around the floor of the RCA building and see who had what on their desk and what people were working on. So he came in early one day and waited for Lou. And when he started seeing Lou walk around, he played Girlfriend. And Lou walks in the office and says, Scappa, what's that? It sounds like a hit. He said, it's Matthew Sweet, Lou. He goes, are we signing it? And he goes, well, Lou, we're trying to sign it, but you killed the deal. We had the contracts at the table, and you told Vanderbilt, the attorney, not to finish. And he goes, oh, Vanderbilt screwed up. And the next thing you know, one day later, we had a signed contract. The record came out 2 weeks after Nirvana Nevermind. And I knew the world was changing because I had dinner with a friend, Kim White, who was working the release for Geffen. And I said, Kim, and for our release tour for Girlfriend, and I said, Kim, how's Nirvana going? She goes, amazing, 800,000. I said, 800,000? Oh my God, that record hasn't even been out in a month. She said, no. We had an 800,000 piece day today. They literally, when that record hit, they had to stop manufacturing every record that Geffen was planning to release just to backfill Nirvana orders. They took every capacity from every CD plant around the planet that they could get to catch up with it. And fortunately, thank you, Kurt, Dave, and Chris, and Pat. Fortunately, that record blew a hole so big through radio where it became the #1 album, so all the top 100 records that were previously playing Madonna and CNC had to play it because it was the #1 record.
It knocked Michael Jackson off out of the #1 spot, right? I think.
Yes. Yeah. Crazy, right? Mm-hmm. But so those guys had to play it, and they needed songs with loud guitars that had kind of a song sensibility that would follow through. So we were really fortunate. And that's how our lucky break happened. That's probably lesson 2 from this business, is that persistence and focus can keep you sane, especially when you believe in it. You have to stay persistent through the process. And lucky enough, it worked out.
It's interesting, because like Nevermind also is very dry, drier and very kind of anti-80s in that way, right? And
yeah, Butch's mixes are very different than Andy's mixes. So Andy's mixes use a lot of AMS harmonizer on the guitars, AMS RMX 16. I don't, it had a very different feel than the touch and go records that Butch had done, that were why Kurt and those guys sought Butch Vig out as a producer in the first place. But that's a better story for somebody else to tell. That's just a secondhand observer story.
Well, we can make a connection, a tie-in here, because that album, that Nirvana Nevermind, was recorded, studio
Sound City.
Sound City, thank you. In Van
What
Nuys.
A perfect segue.
Which a perfect segue to I guess so. Weezer, Pinkerton, which was also recorded, Sound City. You recorded that in '96, is that, or it came out in '96?
Yeah, we actually did it in we did the recording in '95. So it's the end of '94. I'm in Los Angeles for meetings after the holidays. I'm still living in New York, and I get a call from this A&R guy called Todd Sullivan, who's Weezer's A&R guy. And my pal Chris Shaw, who was managed by the same guy, who Chris and I were managed by the same person for years, had done the record with Rick Ocasek. Rick had stopped in, so I kind of knew Rick. He had stopped in while we were making the Sloan album for Geffen. And so we all had some familiarity, and I'd been around a couple of Weezer shows, but I get this call from Todd all of a sudden saying, "Hey, are you still in LA?" I said, "Yeah, why?" It's like, "Well, Weezer's here. They have some more stuff to do." And I was only there. I was going to go back that morning, and I would have gotten on the plane really early that day, but Kennedy was closed due to snow. So I was snowed in. So I told Todd the situation. He's like, "Great. I've got a record for you. Meet me at Sound City. We're going to, I need you on Weezer." So, and I was a huge fan. So it was a huge, huge break.
A fortunate flight delay.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. And that was a lesson in back to persistence and back to why some of the things that sucked about analog recording. We're in the B room at Sound City, which was another beautiful sounding 8028 Neve. One of the first ones that came into LA, and a wonderful linoleum tiled floor with, that you can hear a lot of on any of the recordings that come out of there, and wood walls, a beautiful, nice sounding room, and a dump. If you could find sofas on the street that would be cleaner than any of the ones in that studio. You could pull them out of a dumpster. They'd still be nicer than any of the furniture in that studio. Half the chairs were broken down. The chairs in the control room sucked, but damn it, that console in that room sounded great. So the remit with these guys is we have some ideas, finish recording, and with those guys, a lot of it is just Rivers and Matt knew exactly what they needed to do, stay out of their way. and get sounds quickly. Don't take any time on them. Stay as out of their way as possible, and don't let the process delay them. That's the theory. For those of you who dealt with Studer A800 machines, and had to synchronize them, you may remember that the Mark IIIs would synchronize consistently, but the Mark I machines were a disaster. And unfortunately, Sound City B had a Mark III and a Mark I, which made it almost impossible to get them to lock up. And so first thing we're trying to do is to make work reels to bounce 24 track masters down to a few tracks to put additional vocals and overdubs on. And that's just not working. And I'm losing my mind because the last thing I ever want to do for those guys in particular is delay the process. But we're 2 hours into it, and I finally said, hey guys, I'm going to deal with this. Go enjoy your day. I'll call you. So they take off. And we start a flurry of calls around every studio. How do we get this thing working? Every tech, Sound City's tech couldn't figure it out. Finally, somebody at Skip Saylor, I think it was, said, oh, the only way to get that room to work is you have to go to Design Effects, one rental house, and get this particular synchronizer and these two specific cards that had the right firmware for the machine. We did that 7 hours later, or 7 or 8 hours later, by the time those cards were delivered. We're up and running. Make work reels quickly. We come in for overdubs. Back to trying to work in the way that these guys like to work. So 3 singers singing simultaneously. We started with vocals and we went back and did a lot of other instrument stuff. 3 singers singing simultaneously. We didn't want a whole lot of them bleeding into each other's mics, but they wanted to be able to see and vibe off of each other. So there's 3 mics set up in a line, and no individual punch-ins. They record as an ensemble, almost like a 3-person choir. But everybody's got a mic in front of them so you can emphasize it a little more, but there's a lot of the sound of the room and everything. And, again, in another time and in another environment, people would think it's absolutely the wrong thing to do. But for this, and when it was about capturing a performance and capturing the feel and the spirit of the room, it was the only way to do it.
And so just to verify, so the you're saying you had the 3 vocalists in the same room in a line, but just singing live together. So no overdubs later, which is
no
already...
overdubs later, no punch-ins.
No punch-ins.
Yeah.
It's very impressive.
No,
Do you want to listen to a little bit of it?
Punch in, but if you're punching in all 3, you're not doing any individual punch-ins. So if they collectively decided that we should do, if it's like, Matt, that's a little flat, or Matt wasn't happy because he's a little flat, and then riffers would be like, it sounds good. Just go with it, because the blend was there. Or
yeah, and of course it's those like little out of tune things that make it both, relatable and musical, and also very Weezer, in a way that is so likable, like they are, and their music is, right?
It's approachable. One of the things I used to tell musicians a lot, and this will segue into the a little bit into one of the records we're talking about later. Everybody it got to this point where they thought their performances should be corrected to the grid, and that's the point where I thought that records started to really become uninteresting to me. If you listen to the classic Stevie Wonder song "All in Love Is Fair," listen to it twice at the intro, piano, and then Stevie coming in with band. You only have to listen a few, 2 bars after the band comes in. Listen to it once without counting. Listen to how beautiful the thing is, and then count along with it at the intro. The intro is a freaking train wreck. Nobody would ever know because the rest of the performance is so intact, it means nothing. At the point that we started to perfect stuff and worse yet, auto-tune stuff. And I know it's an artistic tool, and whatever tool you can use to get your vibe, that's great. But man, it became as interesting as editing a Word doc to me.
Yeah, and then especially, yeah, it's such a different world, you know, when you both have to play everything live and then sing everything live, no auto tune, you know, no grid, or you know, it's just. But it's when you get these musicians like this band or these bands that we're listening to tonight, it's just magic, you know, when you can have an engineer and producer like yourself, right, you know, who can like knows how to capture it in a way that amplifies the music, you know, what they're trying to communicate musically, right? So they're trying to communicate certain things, and they get you, and then you're able to like help them to communicate that to the listener. I mean, that's just so special. And it's you're right, it's very different now with DAWs and grids and
Yeah,
tuning.
and you know, DAWs aren't inherently evil, just like digital isn't evil. Digital can be wonderful in the hands of somebody who knows what to do and not to do. Please don't clip. But you know, no tool is inherently bad, but you know, I guess it's kind of a guns don't kill people, people kill people argument if you play it out.
Yeah.
Do you want to pick you're a big fan of that. Pick what you think is the most
Well, you had mentioned one that you had worked on in particular in that session. Was it Get You? That's a great
Yep.
song.
Yeah, Get You. I mean, I've worked at some point little bits on everything, but yeah, take your pick.
Yeah, I mean, I really love all of these. Yeah, Get You is like one of my favorites. You know, I mean, even the opening one, Tired of Sex, is
Or
great.
El Scorcho. The beginning of El Scorcho is another. That's that room.
Let's take a listen. Yeah, we'll listen to El Scorcho here.
Yeah. The funny thing about that record, you know, when I hear it back, it's so much those guys. And it's again trying to not timestamp the record with the effects that were popular that day. So that's, you know, something that I thought about at the time, but not really put a lot of thought to. And when it comes to mixing, Rivers is such a gifted arranger. He knows exactly what he wants to hear in his mind. It's just back to get out of the way.
So interesting too. And there was for people who don't know, there was a little like, you know, when this album first came out, you know, it was maybe didn't sell quite as well. And
the word you were looking for is stiff. It's stiffed in the marketplace, and the label was like, what the fuck? What? Pardon. You know what did you do to our hit band? Now I'm happy to say that in terms of sales trajectory, it actually drives more sales in current times than some of the other bigger hit records, because it's got this cult thing. It's very much an expression of capturing who those guys were at that time.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to see them live during this tour in the Ventura Theater, and they came through. And I'm not sure if like Matt Sharp, the bass player who left like around after this recording, was at that concert or not. But I do remember hearing about how, still being kind of shocked at how, yeah, the singer Rivers, the songwriter, was, yeah, I guess kind of hurt or upset by how this, because their first album, which came out in '94, that Blue album, was so successful and so popular, and then this one maybe didn't quite achieve that like immediately, but you know, and it was for him, I guess, like more personal, like the lyrics even, you know, were very personal, specific types of lyrics for him, right? And
yeah, and this is all while he's like also studying opera at I want to say Yale or Harvard. I forget which of
I
the
think it was
other.
Harvard, right? Yeah,
It was Harvard, right?
Yeah.
And you know, he's an incredible capacity, incredible musician, and this is something that he really felt, I think, was an expression of, you know, so many motifs there. And alas, initially it did not. Yeah, initially it did not receive the praise, and it didn't have as, you know, as obvious a single as the other ones. I think in
Yeah.
retrospect.
I think this was the main single, if I remember. Right? The El Scorcho or one of the, I think.
I don't even remember
I remember
how
watching that
they
video.
dropped it in.
Yeah. But then after this, like he didn't really write songs, if I remember, in the same sort of very personal way, because he felt like it wasn't, he felt sort of hurt maybe by this experience in some way. But now, like you said, it's like the cult classic that everybody loves out of all the Weezer albums, even like he record, and including most people, when you go back, it's just sort of like the quintessential. That's why it's so great to talk with you about like some behind the scenes stuff. Did you do like similar as far as like miking and that kind of stuff goes that you did at the Matthew Sweet album, or was it different?
Even so, this is a point in my time where I started in my career where I started miking everything from farther away, rather than a microphone shoved in front of a guitar amp and something else in back. Kind of it dawned on me that, like, wait, if what I'm really doing is trying to capture the sound of something farther away, and this is an overdub anyway, and that's the only thing that's going to be happening at this point in time, why not just walk into the room to where it sounds right and drop a pretty linear sounding mic there? Back to my love for Ruling Care 4011s, KM56s, KM84s. With the transformer, I didn't think the 184, where they took the transformer out of it, was a positive thing to my ear. It just made it sound too brittle. Why not just find a relatively neutral mic and put it in the space where things sound right and see how close that got you to it? Other funny thing, in this session, I did an R&B record with a guy called Tashawn, and this is back on small diaphragm microphones. Tashawn had this beautiful tenor R&B voice. We were doing a cover of I Want You, the R&B classic. And I said, and I was just brought in one day to help record his lead vocal. And I asked him what mic he usually used and what he used on the rest of the record. And he said, AKG 451. And then he saw me look, he goes, yes, the hi-hat mic. Okay. So I put a 451 up, parallel to the floor. He backed off of the mic about 2.5, 3 feet and opened his mic, and it was the most perfect, needed no compression, needed no EQ, had incredible dynamic control, record and play, mic pre to tape.
Wow. So
back to, you might have rules, but never stop experimenting with the microphones that you have access to, with the settings.
For those that don't know, the 451, you get the hi-hat. It has a high frequency, a little bit of a high frequency boost, right? It's so like people use it for hi-hats a lot, and usually you wouldn't use it on a voice, especially because it's a small diaphragm, and it's just, I've never seen it used in that way, but isn't it so? But you.
And parallel to the floor. So, back to Ruling Care microphone days. Even an omnidirectional microphone is directional with respect to high frequencies. And the relationship goes more or less where the diameter of the capsule hits about the size of a wavelength. The microphone is directional above that frequency, more or less. So you can still take an omnidirectional microphone if you're getting too much lift off the top end, just steer it off axis.
Yeah.
Ruling Care also used to make for the Omnis a nose cone that would make the pattern more radiant, and you'd put the microphones pointing in the air. So they wouldn't have any of that direct high frequency content, and they would be super, super linear. So, I like a transducer that can add color sometimes. But man, if it sounds great to me where I'm standing in the room, let's get that.
Yeah, totally. Sorry, Rick, I see your hand raised there. Do you have a question?
Or is it the previous
comment more?
Yes, go ahead.
The 451 series also has a capsule made for vocal use called the CK5, which is the cardioid capsule CK1 stuck in a ball-style windscreen with a shock mount, and they work very well.
Yeah, they're
Uh,
great.
I got introduced to them by Judy Collins, and that was her vocal mic.
Wow. That makes a lot of sense. And she's another one who has such a pure voice, right?
Yeah.
Although now I've got Send in the Clown stuck in my head, so that's
I did want to play a little bit of I'll play a little bit of that Get You, but like one of the things too, and you probably can't hear it over the Zoom screen share, but like, you know, is that like sort of the things I love about the sound of this album is there's this sort of tape saturation, but like or something like that sort of you can feel in a way that like matches the music so well, like the energy and the distortion and the lyrics and the voices being a little bit out of whatever, you know, and it's just, yeah.
I'm really good. I was really good in those days at making sure that I was listening to things off of the repro head, even though it would occasionally, the musicians, if they were open-minded, you warn them about it, would see it as kind of a challenge to stay in time with the track, even though they're playing at a different time. But just for the purpose of getting sounds up, if you're listening off the repro head, you could do a lot better job dialing it in.
Very cool. Let's listen to a little bit of that, like Get You one that we had talked about there. Let me sure. And then we'll move on to the next. Yeah, I love when it gets like louder there during the chorus and you can feel like in the cymbals, especially, you know, you can like really feel that like intensity of that saturation. It's really
Master Ride, Master Fader Ride.
Pushing it. That's great. Yeah. So a little segue to the next album there. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment for those of you who did not have the fortune or misfortune of having to work with analog tape. When we talk about listening off the repro head, so an analog machine would have 3 heads on it: and erase, record, and playback. So when you listen to the play, and you know they had to be in that order, right? But sometimes you could choose whether you're monitoring the input to the machine or if you're listening to the playback. And of course, there would be a time offset from between record and playback, so you couldn't do that a whole lot. But doing that as you're setting up a sound and pulling off the tape gave you a lot better sense of what you were going to get from the session than listening to the input machine of the machine, having the tape do its thing, and then listening back off of it, hearing something different at playback. Eliminates some of that. Why doesn't this sound like it did when we were recording?
Interesting. Yeah, that's yeah, it's interesting now, you know, how people don't really, I guess a lot of people are recording to tape now as well, you know, but anyway.
God bless them. The downside is some of these records we'd have, 40, 60, 80, 100 2-inch reels, literally, 2 tons of magnetic tape. That would accompany the album when it would go somewhere to move to a different studio. So good to not have that. Bad news is, if you're a DJ, you can lose your entire set if your thumb drive goes down.
That's true. That's true. Very interesting. So did anyone else, by the way, have questions before we move on to the next album? Be sure to give a second here.
So as we're pulling up this next one, this segues into, I think, the title of today's panel on being sane in insane places, because in making records in this era, things were often slower. First of all, people still didn't have access, for the most part, to home recording gear. Or if they did, they may have an 8-track Tascam machine or something to lay up demos. They might have a decent mic, but people, for the most part, were doing stuff. You're doing stuff in the studio, and studios were busy and all of that. But when you're working on a record like this Everclear album we're about to listen to, which was one of the first records that I did where everybody wanted it corrected to the grid, for me, it got really arduous to be in the same room with the same 3, 4, 5 people in, it might be a really nice room, but for 4 or 6 months in 3 different cities. So one of the things that I found helped me a lot, because especially in winter in, a city like Portland, when we were doing overdubs, I can get, or like our beloved Seattle, it can get pretty harsh in the winter sometimes, especially if you're already not seeing the light of day anyway. And we're working in those days, 6 days a week, 5 days a week, generally 6 days a week, anywhere between 10 and 14 hours a day. It gets to be too much. And for me, this was a record where I actually just got to a point where I had to call in somebody else to mix it and leave, because I just couldn't stay. I found it really depressing to listen to the same 12 or 14 songs in a room with the same dynamics, with the same with the same people for 6 months. But this record, and it was an inflection point for me, because this was the point where I stopped really loving it, because there was less spontaneity. We were correcting things to the groove, or to the click. The groove wasn't as important as the alignment was. That was de rigueur at the time. We had a brilliant musician and producer in his own right. Eric could do all of the Pro Tools editing. So I'd be in the control room with the band, or maybe using the studio, and Eric would be in what's originally an overdub booth with a pair of headphones on or a pair of small speakers, cutting everything precisely to quantize it onto the grid, which of course now we can do with the press of a button. But did it make better music? Well, this ended up being this band's biggest record, and we had a multi-platinum release on it. And again, props to Neil Avron, who did a freaking beautiful job realizing the mix of the record. But for me, this became a point where, like, I gotta stop doing this. And this was sort of the beginning of the time when I decided it was time for me to make a transition into the digital side of the business, and then ultimately back into recording tech, where I am today.
And so this was in we're talking about Everclear so much for the Afterglue, which came out in 97, right? So did you record it in 96 or was
Yes. Yeah. So we recorded it in 96. We started in A&M Studio A on the Air Studios Neve. Andy Monroe, the brilliant studio designer who did the Air London rooms, was around a lot because he's a friend, and we were testing the prototypes of what became almost all of the Dynaudio powered speakers. Slight problem. My artists like to listen really loud in the control room, and generally when Andy would walk into the room, he'd walk up to the console, and the first thing he'd do would go and turn the monitoring levels down, because he's seeing we had his speakers on the verge of clipping, not pretty nonstop. But it's recorded in A&M Studio A. Madonna had a beautiful little studio with a perfect 8068 called Brooklyn, where we did some of the overdubs. We finished most of the overdubs at White House, and I can't even remember where they mixed it, White House in Portland, but we finished a lot of the overdubs at White House in Portland.
Very cool. Sorry, before someone just pointed out Janie had a question.
Yeah, sorry, Jamie.
Oh, no problem. I just had a comment more than a question. Going back to the Weezer, it's like what you're talking about with the Everclear is a totally different recording process. And because I record live music, but I'm not in the studio. I'm live. I'm remote, whatever, and so I never record things the way you did with Everclear. It's always, on the fly with, everybody in one room and live, and, it's like, to me, that kind of recording process captures more of a live sound. I mean,
Well,
to my
captured
mind.
more of a live sound and live feel, and there are things that we don't care about as much. Again, we don't care about if the performance is to the grid. We just care about, was it a good take or not? Is it a good performance or not? Was that the best night we had for this recording or not? And I love that kind of recording. The records that brought me the most joy to record, I've done a few that are live to 2-track with really great musicians. I love working that way. I love, that. And another one I'm really proud of is I did a record with the reunion of the band Big Star, which was Alex Chilton's band. It's kind of a cult classic record. We had no sound check, and I recorded it straight to 24-track in a remote truck that I had worked in when I was coming up, Metro Mobile in Chicago. And, we remixed it later. And honestly, when I listen back to it now, I'm thinking, the board mix that we had as we were monitoring live somehow feels more appealing to me than the remixes of the same masters we did later, because you get that spark in that moment. I see we have a couple of questions from a couple of people with raised hands in the participant list. So Michael.
MJ has his hand raised there. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, James. On the last tune by Weezer, I noticed the bass was really tight. I like how you had like a looser drum sound, but that bass was so tight. I was wondering how you achieved that, or was that more of a mastering thing?
Bass, precision, the bass guitar in particular, precision bass, LA2, Pultec on the back side of it.
Simple, just direct.
But
no cabinet.
But no, there was a cabinet blended in as well, but it was combined to one channel, and the in capturing it, the amount of gain reduction was pretty significant, right? The meters on the old LA2s were kind of slow in their ballistics anyway, but the meters pretty much straight up and down the whole time. And a lot of it's the player. I mean, that's kind of Matt.
Yeah, Matt Sharp, who was there for the first 2 records, and then he started the Rentals, and then did his own thing on his own project he pursued, right? But I mean, do you think that a lot of people really believe, including me, that like the band was never really the same after he left?
It's like Wilco, where you have really 2 fundamentally different bands doing 2 fundamentally different things, and the only commonalities of Case and Wilco are Jeff, the lead singer, and John Stewart, the bass player. They're inherently different bands, but it's hard. I couldn't say I like one era or one band more, because I think they've done pretty meritorious stuff on both sides of it.
That's true, but you're right. I didn't mean to compare them better or worse, but what I meant is
no, I didn't think you were. I didn't think you were saying that, but it had to.
But it does feel like they were just never really. Yes, of course, with a band like that, where you have somebody and you lose an important member, like the bass player who was doing all those like harmonies and stuff. Like
not only that, but there was I can tell you, I didn't see their collaboration earlier, but there was definitely like an interplay of there was an interplay. I don't want to say power isn't the right word. There was a creative interplay between those two, and it didn't exactly feel like tension, but there was let me say an evaluative pressure, maybe, right?
What do you mean by that?
I gotta get this. I gotta get this right, because I know that dude is watching me on this take, and they could play it themselves or sing it themselves if I don't get it right.
Interesting.
Not that they would ever do that, but I think those 2 held each other to a high standard.
So interesting. Yeah. So this Weezer one was came out in '96, and then the Everclear album that you were talking about. We could play a little bit of it. Let's go ahead and play it, and then we can sort of listen for, you were talking about the grid and the sort of exactness of it. Do you have a certain song?
Probably everything. Everything to Everyone or Father of Mine, which were both the singles, are pretty exemplary of what was going on with that record.
Okay, yeah, I'll play that. It looks like Everything to Everyone's the first one here.
Yep. On the grid.
It sounds great though. I mean, like that everything about all of those instruments, just sounds really amazing.
There was a lot of clarity, but this is again at the point where this record was the last record that I did where everything was really like arguably, by the higher professional standard of the day. So everything was mic'd close and tight and direct, and funny thing. That is back to, I'm really lucky with the singers, because that is exactly what Art sounds like when you plug him into a microphone and put a compressor on it. The first thing that he instinctively does is he starts checking level on the mic and hearing where the compressor kicks in, and then he controls his dynamics, because he knows exactly how he wants the compression to sound in his headphones.
That's so interesting. Yeah, you well, we should also mention the first two albums that we were just listening to. You recorded but didn't you didn't get production credit on it. But this one you were the producer, right? You produced.
I was a co-producer with Art. I co-produced the record with Art in the band. And with that particular song, we originally had 3 drum sets going on at the same time. And back to, I left this record because I just couldn't stand being in the studio anymore. At that point, I needed a serious mental health break. I was seriously burnt out after 6 months on it. And one day it's like, I hear the track back. It's like, oh, the other 2 drum sets are gone. It was probably a stupid idea.
And so where did you were talking about the grid, and this would have been, in 96, 97, like, which was like obviously the very early days of Pro Tools.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Was that from Art, or who was sort of pushing for that type of control?
It wasn't exactly Perry Watts Russell, who was the A&R guy, who was a pretty musical guy. And Perry was also very much a stand out of the artist's way and tell them whether they got it right or wrong sort of guy. He had really good instincts. Art really wanted to make a record that was competitive with the market. And, he aspired to have a record that would land at the top of the market. So it was really driven a lot from Art. And, I played right into it, because I'm like, okay, then, here's how everybody's doing this. This is what we do. And everybody was on board. And boy, and look, it came out well. The results speak for themselves. So it was a really great, it was the band's best-selling record. But boy, was that not a fun record to make. Because
it doesn't sound like fun. Yeah. I mean, especially back then, you must have had, because what made it take so long?
Slow, deliberate, Steely Dan-esque precision. Some musicians, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus for not having their lyrics written when we came into the recording studio, but one particular singer-songwriter on that album, which only has one. Okay, Art didn't have his lyrics done. He was writing a lot of them on the fly. And his quality control for his records was great, but if he didn't feel like he had it, he would just, disappear. Like, I'm going to go ahead and just go do this. At one point near the end of it, I'm like, and this is when I saw the end coming, it's just like, why don't we take a couple of weeks off? I can go mix another record and you can write your lyrics. I called the A&R guy back, Perry, and I said, this is what I want to do. I think it's the right thing for the record. Art can kind of put his headspace just on the lyrics, and Art hated that. Which is another thing. Never be careful that when you're talking to your artist A&R guy, make sure they know you're going to talk to their A&R guy to suggest an idea. Art did not like that. But fortunately, again, we are still friends.
Oh, that's good. Didn't he also, I mean, I'm reaching back in my memory, but didn't Art himself also work as an A&R guy later? Or something?
He aspired to. I think he might have had something going with Capital, but at that point I was so far out of the business that I wasn't really paying attention.
Yeah. And so you felt like this album kind of pushed you a little bit out of.
Yeah, it pushed me out of my comfort zone, but also pushed me out of what I loved about recording music.
It's interesting.
Fortunately, a few months after this, I got a chance to work with the Tragically Hip, and that was magical. So for those of you guys who don't know the Hip, and pardon my hiccups, Gord Downey, the Tragically Hip are a uniquely Canadian band that write a lot about Canadian culture and history, and whose songs tend not to translate south of the 49th parallel. And truly, only the only American markets they succeeded in, I think the farthest south was New York. They could sell out, a 5,000 or 7,000 seat show here, but then everybody would be waving the Canadian flags because they'd be speaking to the performing for the Canadian diaspora. Cities like Detroit, where they would get a lot of the radio from over the border in Windsor, they'd be really successful. But south of there, virtually nobody knew of them. But in Canada, a country with less than a tenth of the population of the United States, they were routinely selling millions of records. And Gord Downey, who we lost a few years back to brain cancer, was an incredibly generous soul and probably one of the most powerful, focused performers I'd ever worked with. So this is a mix record. And I got called by Steve Berlin to do this record. Steve is another musician, the producer and founding member of Los Lobos, who I've made a bunch of records with. And we mixed at Brian Adams' Warehouse studio in Vancouver. The band liked the idea of working in Canada, and I just love that studio. It is a really tremendous place.
Which studio?
The Brian Adams Warehouse studio in Vancouver. So in those days, in Vancouver, British Columbia. So in those days, the studio had 2 consoles. They have another one, what was originally the Atlantic Air Series Neve, which was the last 4 that Rupert made before he left the company, that are sort of the precursors to the Focusrite designs. And then the other, but theirs has a twist. The tech there, Ron Obvious, was mentored by the great John Vertasek, who, if any of you ever encountered, was probably one of the greatest recording studio techs of our era. And Ron is certainly, he'd never admit it, but he's certainly on parallel with John. Those guys, when they went through the Neve to rebuild it, they built a bucket of 8 SSL modules that they made look exactly like Neve modules cosmetically, including with the knobs. So when you look at the console, it's like, that's great. Wait a second, these consoles didn't have a bell. Oh my God, there's a channel compressor. Oh, there's an SSL mix compressor. What the hell is this thing? So it's kind of got the hybrid of best of both worlds. This I mixed on the J series, which is no longer there, but that's another console that I really love because it had another full octave of bottom relative to the Neve.
Cool. Let's take a listen here. I have it queued up. Let me just share. Yeah, I love that part where it pushes a little bit in that about 2 minutes in.
That bridge.
Yeah, that bridge is like another instrument that comes in. So there's something there that was.
There's some synth pads that Steve Berlin put on, and first and foremost, this track was brilliantly recorded by the band's longtime sound engineer Mark Frinken, who did it in their API-equipped bathhouse studios in Kingston, Ontario, and then I mixed it in Vancouver. So there's that, and then there's a wonderful pedal steel guitar player named Bob Egan, who adds more depth and pads on the bottom. The funny thing about Bob is that he's on my very first album as a producer, Sold American's Fee, so it was kind of a full circle trip for us. But that's, again, a record that, you know, by Canadian standards, I think we were triple platinum on that one. Wow. It was a ridiculously successful record.
It's an interesting market up there, right? Because they have those requirements for radio. So like 30 or 40%. I forget the exact number.
There are 4 elements: producer, composer, artist, and production, composer, artist, and label. The PAML score, each of which are worth 1/4 of a credit. And on the average, you need to have 1/4 across, or it used to be that you used to have 1/4 across Canadian content across all radio, but you could carve it together out of different pieces. And, you know, for a country like Canada or for other countries, I can totally understand the concept of not wanting to, you know, American and global multinationals are so powerful with marketing. I can understand the idea of wanting to maintain a place for local artists to develop, and Canada has brought us a disproportionate share of successful artists, whether it's back to, you know, Drake, Sarah McLachlan, BTO, Overdrive, go through the list, Neil Young, you know, Bruce Coburn, whoever, Joni Mitchell. There are plenty of wonderful artists that have come in that country who may not have had a chance, or as much of a chance, if they hadn't had a safe playing field to develop locally.
That's interesting. I'd never actually thought about it in that way with the marketing, especially regarding American, you know, global marketing, and how dominant I'm sure it would be in particular if they didn't have those rules about, you know, a certain number of Canadian artists, 25% or whatever ish, on the radio and other types of airplay. Because you're right, I mean, it's really actually wonderful for Canadian artists and allows for them to really thrive and make a living, you know.
Well, and studios too, right? I mean,
totally
artist studios, all these things that wouldn't otherwise exist.
Yeah, studios, venues, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, before we go too far, I don't want to leave out that Wilco being there. What year did this one the Tragically Hip, was that all 98? Is that what?
Yeah, so funny, you made a great segue, because Bob Egan is also the steel player on this. Bob Egan is one of the steel players on this. The other one is the aforementioned Greg Lease, who I was speaking about with Steve Turnage earlier.
Yes, the pedal steel you're talking about?
Yep.
Yes, yeah, it's just, yeah. It sounds great on both records, but especially on, yes.
So Wilco's being there is it's a complicated record for me. It's an album that I love deeply, and I love the band deeply. It was mixed by 3 different people, and the band selected different mixes from different people. I actually co-produced some of the record with this. When I got involved, Jeff gave me the latitude to, you know, have a co-producer credit on the record, and I brought in some things like I brought in Jerry Hay, and, you know, and the top LA horn section for rock records, who play on the song Monday. Greg Lease is all over the record on steel. But back to that idea of when an artist has the inspiration, get out of their way. Jeff and Matthew Sweet are both people I know who are constantly creating songs. And Jeff literally can walk down the hall of the studio and you can see him kind of raise an eyebrow and start playing something that comes to his mind. And all of a sudden, the entire song comes out, music and words together. It just comes out as one stream, one flow. So when I brought the record to Ocean Way to mix, which I feel bad about on some level, because I knew that musically it was the right combination of console and room to do the project in. What I didn't understand, not having had my own kids, and I didn't have my own kids until almost 20 years later, 10 years later, is that Jeff had just had his first baby. So here, poor Sue Miller, I deeply apologize to you again for doing this. Sorry to take your husband away 2 weeks after you had your baby. But your kids turned out fine. Anyway, your kids turned out amazing. Anyway, so
it was recorded in, he lives and the band is in Chicago, right? And
yes,
so
it was recorded largely at Chicago Recording Company, a studio which sadly just closed this year, which was a studio that did a lot of jingle work by day. But when there are some of the songs where when I came in at the end of the record, hadn't been composed yet, and quite literally happened as we were mixing, and Jeff would say something like, see that mic pointing to a C12 that was sitting in there, ready to do an overdub. Just turn that on and put it to a track. I got an idea. Those songs are Red Eyed and Blue and The Only One. And what other ones are there's some more stuff like that happened on the record, but it's probably a good transition. And
I always thought that was a great name, by the way, Red Eyed and Blue. Like, that's clever. But I would have never thought, like, because it sounds like it fits into the record so well. Like, both of those songs do. Never thought it was like just sort of added, sort of recorded and
ties into the turmoil of what it's like to make a record and to be a touring musician, especially, when you're in a remote city and you have a newborn and your wife's at home and you miss her.
So you mentioned there were overdubs. It was the pedal steel and then
Jay Farrar. Not Jay Farrar, Jay Bennett.
Jay Bennett, I'm sorry, yeah, Jay Bennett.
Yeah, Jay Farrar was his former collaborator and Uncle Tupelo. Jay Bennett, sadly, this is like, oh my God, everybody I'm talking about is dead this year. But Jay Bennett died a few years after this of, living a hard life. But he was a multi-instrumentalist from downstate Illinois, and he was a guy who could literally pick up anything, and in 30 seconds he'd know how to play it. Guitar, mandolin, keyboards. He was kind of the special sauce of that era of the band.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many cool little sounds, especially all those little keyboards and I don't know if it's this album or the later one with the Mellotron and like. There were all these.
The Mellotron's a lot of John McEntire from his records.
Oh, okay.
Which are equally beautiful.
Yeah, and so Jay put on a lot of it. And I remember, do you remember watching what was the movie I Am Trying to Break Your Heart?
I'm Trying to Break Your Heart was the album after this one.
Right. And there was a movie that came out kind of about the recording of the album. I don't know if you watched that or not.
That's it.
Yes, that's it. I always felt bad for Jay though, because I felt like they made him out to be the bad guy in that record.
Can I tell you a funny story about that movie? I was down in Austin in South by Southwest, and I had never seen the movie, and people were telling me I should see it. So I went and bought a copy of it on DVD at Waterloo Records. And I got it home and I went to listen to it, and I tried to take it out of the case and I couldn't get out of the case, and I pulled it wrong and it snapped in half. And I figured that's probably the sign from above that I shouldn't watch it. So I've never watched it since.
Did you watch it the first time?
What's that?
Did you watch it Did you watch it at all?
No.
Oh, you didn't watch it? Yeah.
So, but with that, we should play. We're going super long and people are super patient. So I don't know how many people we have left.
Sorry. I'm just enjoying
Yeah.
myself too much.
Oh, me too. I appreciate the time.
So you mentioned Red Item Blue. Put my little
Yeah.
playlist.
And this is
here.
quite literally what happens when you record everything through the C12 in the room, whether the piano is close to it or not. And it just works.
It's so cool. And so he had you said he wrote that one.
Literally,
on this.
I have this idea, turn on that mic. Wow. And that song came together in under 2 hours.
Was it one mic for the guitar and the vocals, or just the guitar, and you'd add the vocals later?
It was one mic where he was playing guitar and singing, and then everything else was recorded from that one mic.
Huh. You'd never know. It sounds so great. Yeah, such a cool
It's
sound.
all C12, and and then smoothing provided by the Ocean Way Live Chamber.
That was one thing too. So it's very, because like on the Matthew Sweet record that we listened to, it was, very dry, obviously. And then this one, there's this reverb on it. It's really beautiful, And so was that Ocean Way chamber?
It's the live chamber in Ocean Way.
Famous sound that's one like the
It's the Pet Sounds room, actually.
Pet Sounds, yeah, that's so cool. It sounds such a yeah. And then was that Jay on keyboards as well?
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. And then so what was the one you mentioned, the brass, because you added brass
Monday,
yeah. Let's play that as well, just to listen. And so did you do the arrangement, or who did the arrangement?
I did the arrangement. I sketched out the arrangement on staff paper, and then Jerry Hay came in, looked at it, didn't play a thing. He said, change this. And in the middle break of the thing, you'll hear where I had written a kind of standard bluesy horn figure, or R&B horn figure, like da 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 da. And Jerry, genius that he is like, I'm changing that, and he changes it at the end of the line. So at the end of the line, so it goes da 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 da. Ba, ba. So it sounds like they actually miss by a step and then come back. And they're like, okay, that's brilliant. And then he said, okay, I got a couple other ideas. So it's really started as my idea, and it ended up as Jerry's.
So what are the instruments exactly?
It is 2 trumpets and 2 tenors, no trombone.
No trombone.
Oh, and a Barry. We did a second track of Barry by one of the tenors. But that was his thing. Unlike the Tom Tom 84 sound, where Tom Tom used to love to use trombone players, Jerry was not about trombone at all.
And that's on Monday, right?
Yep.
Okay, let's take a listen here.
Jerry Hay. And the horn section from every Michael Jackson record.
Oh, wow. Very cool. That's so was the horn your idea, or was it the horn section?
Yeah. No, that was a session call. We should.
That's so interesting, because you had mentioned, that's right, that like originally you guys had agreed that you would be a co-producer, right?
Yeah, so I have a co-production credit on the first release of the record, and when the record wanted to re-release for whatever reason, somebody missed the co-production credit. But that is unfortunately life making records.
Oh wow, that's too bad. Yes, but that's why obviously you would be thinking about brass as a producer, right? You in that moment. Yeah, it's a great arrangement. I love it fits really
Jerry,
well. What made you want it? What made you think about that with this song?
It felt like a Stones era song from the Memphis era. It was, and I just kind of heard it in my head. So I studied arranging at the University of Iowa when I was working in the recording studio. And I had really fortunate again. I had a brilliant mentor, a guy named Ed Sarath, who now for many years has taught the jazz department at the University of Michigan. And if it wasn't for him and other guys like, Brett Svacek, who taught for many years at SUNY Oneonta, and is a freaking killer trombone player, I probably wouldn't be here today, because there's so much of what I learned in arranging and just even basic theory from those guys on the fly. And it wasn't like a traditional a classical approach to theory, but it was just a lot more pragmatic. And again, if being a producer and mixer is one thing, it's about putting different tools in the toolbox. And I think this is where I should probably start to wrap it out a little bit, or close it out a little bit. It's about amassing as many tools as you can for the profession, whether that is in understanding mental health, your own and others, not being afraid to, when things are going wrong, help a musician find their way into rehab. Done that too many times. Making sure that people, when you're not just the custodian of the music, you're also to a certain degree a custodian of the well-being of the people making the music, and to treat it that way. But collecting tools that you can use to make the task your own, whether it's musical skills. I was never the musician like a guy like Greg Wells is, who's probably the most talented multi-instrumentalist I ever had a chance to work with, and who then became, I think, in the top 3%. I think he said, he posted it the other day, he has like 21 billion streams now or something crazy like that. But truly a deserved musician who can pick up and play anything and write anything at a level of mastery that just is continually inspiring. We're always collecting.
What did he work on
tools.
with you? Sorry, I was just curious.
What's that? Oh, I had no idea he could play anything else, and I hired him to play piano on a Canadian artist called Kim Stockwood in about 1995. And we did the record at Captain and Tennille's place, Rumbo, in Los Angeles, and she introduced me to this Canadian friend, and geez, he had just moved here and he could use a gig, and well, we need piano in this song, and he was like, yeah, I could play that. And he walked in and played on it, and then he played some organ, and then he played some more piano, and little did I know that his main instrument is drums. I had no idea until later.
Wow.
Now, all the big Katy Perry hits, so many other records he's done where he's hit it out of the park. Recently sold his catalog for tens of millions of dollars. God bless him. A wonderful human being, and again, a deeply talented musician. But again, we're collecting tools in the toolbox. So there were still things that, we all know how to do that others don't. And that brings us to the approach that we all have for the art and the task of recording music and live sound and everything. Every experience can be as valid as the next. It's just to keep cobbling them and keep growing and keep learning new things.
Yes, I would love to. Does anyone have questions? I see maybe in the chat there was a couple of.
I think the chats are probably at this point, does this guy ever shut up?
Not at all.
No, Dan, you had a question, didn't you?
No, I just made the comment that with the context of that Wilco song where he's missing his wife and family, that was heartbreaking.
Oh man, but that is like when Jeff expresses himself through, again, I think it's safe to say I've never worked with anybody who is so magically creative as that guy. And a genuinely decent person.
And he's still going. He's still making records. And I mean, anybody who
More
still does that,
successful than ever.
I have so much respect for it, because so many people just stop, later in life or whatever reason, or, and he's still doing great music. And that album came out not too long ago, Cruel Country. It was a great sounding album.
Yeah, there's a new one out this week.
Oh, I haven't heard it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yes.
Well, I tell you what, their last record, I think, it's not that they make bad records, but the last one, the one after Cruel Country, and I'm horrible with album titles when they're not things that I worked on, is remarkable. really a great record.
I still haven't listened to it. I'll have to check it out. Yes, I remember Cool Country because they did it all live, right? I mean, they played it all like in the same room, and it was a different kind of. They were kind of going back to the original type of approach that you were talking about originally, right? With just sort of capturing it.
Yeah, it's funny. We tried to re-record that song Monday at one point as a live recording right after they had played a performance at Chicago Summer Stage for like 250,000 people. So the theory was we'll get a better recording because we'll be live and blah 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 blah. And the answer was we got a better recording before that, and the one we did live just sounded like everybody was tired from everybody was tired from just this exhaustion from playing for 250,000 people live. Wow. Leaving it all on the table.
Yes. Speaking of exhaustion, I mean, so you're in New York right now, right?
Yeah.
So 3 hours ahead. So it's
no, I'm still on Seattle time.
That's okay. Well, that's fair. That's good. Works out then. Because I was thinking it's 12:30 out there, right?
Thank you so much for having me. And if anybody has any other thoughts or questions or things like that, I'm here for them. Otherwise, I may, otherwise I may sign off for the evening and bid you all adieu and thank you for your patience and listening. And if anybody has any questions or thoughts or ideas,
I have one question about the Tragically Hip. You mentioned Mark Frink, their sound engineer.
Mark Frinken, yes.
Oh, not
Mark
Frink.
Not Mark Frink from Sun Sound. Mark Frinken, who's a Canadian.
Okay. Never mind then.
But Mark Frink,
yes,
who later went on to work, I think, for EAW for years.
Yes, and I knew him as a monitor engineer.
Oh yeah, he's a super talented guy. I knew him from Suzanne Vega, going back that far.
Mm-hmm. And Katie Lang.
Yeah.
And others. Anyway.
And his colleague Robin Danar, who's also another legendary guy from that same Sun Sound crew.
Cool. Very cool. Does anyone have any other questions or anything?
Just just a quick comment. You were talking about people who are still recording later in life, and I think a lot of people don't realize that Peter Gabriel just put out a new CD last year, and he was actually touring for it, and he's got to be like in his 70s now. I mean, it's like,
and the best tour that I've seen in years. I know Steve.
Oh, you saw it?
Okay. That show, right? Yeah. What a tremendous tour. And same musicians. It's Manu Katay and Tony Levin, and he surrounds himself with great people. But Turnage, you were there, right?
I was.
Yeah. What a show.
I really wanted to catch that and was unable to.
The incorporation of visual elements into that show, and most importantly, compelling thought, because he made the show a forum on the evolution, the integration of technology and arguably, and artificial intelligence and supplanting human identity with machine identity to a certain extent, the existential threat that these technologies face. He asked some really compelling questions through the course of his compositions and performances, and in particular, the visual art.
I'll check it out.
Yeah, it also happened to sound really damn good in the house too.
Oh, I'm not surprised. He is one of the few artists who, when I've seen him, when it was Key Arena, he basically insisted that they put velvet curtains over all of the entranceways to every set of seats and everything. And it sounded, I never knew that place could sound that good.
Mm-hmm.
That's how good it sounded. I was totally amazed. And yes, Todd Rundgren is still going too, Michael. Yeah. I just read he's touring also.
Jagger dancing at 80.
Yeah.
And moving better than I can.
Life begins at 50, right?
Exactly right.
I didn't get a chance to see the U2 show at the Sphere, but I had a friend who went. It was pretty amazing. But yeah, they're still touring and playing and recording as well. Wow.
That's great.
Well, we should
Okay.
turn our cameras on and show Jim, Micah, how much we appreciate their work
Yay.
tonight.
Yes.
Thank you,
and
guys.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Jim,
and,
so much. It's just so wonderful to talk with you about these amazing albums. I'm so glad people heard them because they really do sound, even through Zoom screen share or whatever, it still sounds amazing, and you can tell all the tender loving care that went into it, and you can just hear it all through that. And I love how you stay out of the way of the artists and allow them to sort of be themselves.
well,
Yeah,
and
really
most
wonderful.
importantly, when you make a mistake, do it twice in a row.
So they won't
Just
know
for
it's a
backup.
mistake.
Exactly.
That's right.
That's exactly right. Never forget that.
Any other questions?
Oh,
Well,
I
from
just,
Manhattan, everybody, thank you and good night.